So it is my real privilege to invite Professor Naomi Oreskes to give us a talk about climate denial in the US. And I'll just give you a brief personal view of how this happened. A few years ago, I think it was 2011, one of my friends from NOAA gave me, he said, this is a must read, you have to read this book. And the book was The Merchants of Doubt, which was published in 2010 and written by Professor Oreskes. This book actually unveils the systematic climate denial mechanism in the US. And it was really an eye-opener because we know that climate is changing. We know the science. We are scientists. And still, the general public has this notion of the science is still out there. There is a debate. People are not sure. And Naomi's book actually unveils the clever and, should I say, malicious mechanism that operates behind these doubts that are propagated throughout the US public, but also elsewhere in the world. So, without further ado, let me invite Naomi to give us a bit of her wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just give me a moment to bring this back up on the screen. Thank you. Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and I apologize for speaking in English. My parents were atheists, so they didn't send me to Hebrew school. What can I say? So we all know that Donald Trump denies the reality of climate change. If you have not been living in a cave, you know how he has announced the intention of the United States to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords, and on more than one occasion has said that he believes that climate change is a hoax. But the American denial of climate change did not start with Donald Trump. In fact, not even close to that. And so part of what I've been trying to do in my research is to understand, as we just heard, where does this come from? Why do so many people in the United States still think that we don't really know, that the science is settled, that we're not really sure about this issue? So as Yoav just said, this is the subject of the book that I wrote with my colleague Eric Conway, the book Merchants of Doubt. And I'm sad to say that although the book came out 7 years ago, it's still selling very well, unfortunately. I would like to put this to rest and move on and do other things, but it's still a very live issue, unfortunately. So what we showed, what we discovered in our research is that climate change denial has been going on since the 1980s, so nearly as long as the IPCC has been in existence, and it's not an isolated thing. At the risk of sounding like a conspiracy theorist, what we discovered was a network linked to a broad pattern of attempts to discredit science, not just in climate change, but in a set of issues related to public health and the environment. So let me step back a minute and go back 10 years. In 2007, a major poll in the United States showed that 72% of Americans at that time were completely or mostly convinced that man-made global warming was underway. In fact, 62% of Americans believed that life on Earth would continue without major disruptions only if we took immediate and drastic action to reduce global warming. So that's a pretty strong statement. And indeed, even at that time, many people who formerly had doubted climate change in fact now accepted it. So one of them was a man named Frank Luntz, a strategist for the American Republican Party. And he said, in 2006, he said, it's now 2006. So he was off to a good start. He got the year right. And he said, I think most people would conclude that there is global warming taking place, and the behavior of humans he messes up his syntax, but is affecting the climate. Now, why is this man important? Well, he's important because he was the author of a famous, some might say infamous memo in 2003 that was leaked to the press, in which he told Republican candidates running for public office to use the phrase climate change rather than global warming because he said it was a lot less frightening. So the idea was to downplay the threat and to emphasize scientific uncertainty and to insist that there was no consensus. And he wrote, and this is all his own words and his own emphasis, the scientific debate remains open. Voters believe there is no consensus about global warming within the scientific community. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. So here we see in black and white the nutshell of the strategy. Insist there's no consensus in order to prevent action, to confuse the voters so that they will not support action on climate change. Now, of course, Luntz's position about the lack of consensus was incorrect. In 2001, so 2 years before, the IPCC had already stated that human activities are modifying the concentration of atmospheric constituents that absorb or scatter radiant energy. Most of the observed warming over the last 50 years is likely to have been due to the increase in greenhouse gas concentrations. So that was what the scientific community said in 2001. But in fact, the scientific evidence had coalesced earlier. In the second assessment report, published in 1995, the scientific community had concluded that the balance of evidence suggests a discernible human impact on global climate, 1995, so more than 20 years ago. Now, in the early 2000s, I undertook an analysis of the public scientific literature because I was interested in trying to understand whether or not the IPCC statement was consistent with what scientists were publishing in the peer-reviewed literature. And my results showed that it was. And this was the first, many of you have heard the 97% number. Everybody argues about that now. But mine was the first study to actually look at that question. When that study came out, it surprised many people. Many people thought there was a big debate, and I showed that there really wasn't. So this was considered a very surprising and startling result. But it should not have been a surprise. It should have been a yawn. Because if we think about it, in 1992, world leaders had already signed the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which committed the world to preventing dangerous anthropogenic interference in the climate system. So we already knew in 1992 that there was a problem. And indeed, the US president at the time, George H.W. Bush, called on world leaders to translate that written document into concrete action to protect the planet. So this is 25 years ago. So what happened? What happened between President George H.W. Bush and it's hard to say the words President Trump, but I have to. Why didn't we take those concrete steps? Why didn't we act on the scientific knowledge that we had 25 years ago? So this is the story that Eric Conway and I set out to, the question we set out to answer in our book. It's a story of the evolution of climate science and the co-evolution alongside of it with a systematic campaign to challenge that science on political grounds. So let's go back now, and let's talk a little bit about the science. We have known that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas since the mid-19th century. That fact was established by the Irish experimentalist John Tyndall, who did a series of experiments in the 1850s demonstrating that carbon dioxide and water were both greenhouse gases, without which the atmosphere of the Earth, the planet of the Earth, would be much, much colder. So for Tyndall, greenhouse gases were essentially a good thing that helped to explain how the Earth could be warm enough to sustain life, in contrast to the Moon or Mars. Now, in the early 1900s, the Swedish geochemist Svante Arrhenius noticed that when you burn fossil fuels like coal, it produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct, and that this could cause the planet to warm. Arrhenius did the first calculations of what we now call the equilibrium climate sensitivity, and concluded that it was that doubling the CO2 content of the atmosphere would warm the Earth between 1.5 and 4.5 degrees Celsius. And those numbers have not really changed substantially in 100 years. Now, he was Swedish, so he thought warming would be a good thing. The first person to suggest that it might be a bad thing was the British steam engineer Guy Callender. In 1938, he published the first peer-reviewed scientific article that suggested not just that climate change could occur, but actually that it was possibly already underway. Now, of course, in the 1930s and 40s, there were many scientific uncertainties. We hear a lot about the scientific uncertainty about climate change. But one of the things that's very important for all of us to understand is that our predecessors were not stupid. They understood that there were uncertainties associated with cloud feedbacks and water vapor and ocean heat uptake, and they began to address those questions in the 1950s. So climate science got put on hold during World War II, like much of global international science, but in the 50s, people came back to the question. And one of the key uncertainties that was recognized then was the effect of water vapor. Now, some people argued that water vapor, that CO2 would have relatively little effect because of the dominant presence of water vapor in the Earth's atmosphere. The person who addressed that question was this man, Gilbert Plass, who was one of the world's first upper atmosphere spectroscopers, who analyzed the absorption bands of water and CO2 and showed in the 1950s that they were sufficiently distinct that additional CO2 would warm the climate, despite the fact that there was so much more water vapor in the atmosphere. So if you ever hear this issue raised as an uncertainty, and if you pay attention you will, you can tell people that this question was answered 60 years ago by Gilbert Plass. Now, Plass's work came to the attention of two professors at the University of California, where I spent most of my career, Hans Suess, a geochemist, and Roger Revelle, a chemical oceanographer. In 1957, they published an article that's now considered a classic, in which they said that by burning fossil fuels that had been stored over hundreds of millions of years of geologic time, humans were performing a great experiment that could alter the composition of the climate. This idea was taken up by a number of people, including Bert Bolin, who would later found the IPCC, and it became the basis for the beginning of the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by this man, Charles David Keeling, who also taught at the University of California and who I had the privilege of counting as a colleague for many years. In 1958, as part of the International Geophysical Year, Dave Keeling began what became his life's work, the systematic measurement of carbon dioxide, which we now call the Keeling curve. Within a few years, Dave and his colleagues had concluded that indeed CO2 was rising, and that rise was already detectable. And in 1965, they wrote an appendix to a report to the US president in which they predicted that by the year 2000, there will be about 25% more CO2 in our atmosphere than at present, and this will modify the heat balance of the atmosphere to such an extent that marked changes in climate could occur. So if anyone says, well, nobody could have predicted this, the answer is not only could they have, but they did. And they predicted it essentially accurately. In fact, by 2000, it was more like 30% increase in CO2. So 1965. That message, we know, reached the office of US President Lyndon Johnson, who a few months later issued a special message to Congress that was widely read and discussed, in which he wrote, "This generation has altered the composition of the atmosphere on a global scale through a steady increase in carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels." Now, admittedly, in 1965, President Johnson had a few other things to worry about. There's an anecdote that one scientist told me that we have in the book. Henry Abarbanel did a briefing in the Carter White House about climate change, and one of President Carter's staff said, well, when is this all going to occur? And the scientist said, well, maybe in about 50 years. And the staffer says, please come back in 49. So it was hard to interest policymakers in a problem that seemed to be far away. But things began to change already in the 1970s with the rise of climate modeling and the early construction of what we now call GCMs, the general circulation models that model the atmosphere. And with these models, people began to revisit what they called the calendar question. Would a doubling of CO2 in the atmosphere change the Earth's climate, and if so, by how much? And this work in the 1970s by scientists like Suki Manabe and Richard Weatherall confirmed the earlier results of Callender and Arrhenius based on what were essentially back-of-the-envelope calculations. And this did begin to trigger serious discussion in policy circles. The World Meteorological Organization, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the US Department of Energy, and many other groups began to write reports saying this is going to be a real problem in the foreseeable future. Indeed, in 1979, the US National Academy of Sciences first used the word consensus to describe the state of the science, writing, "A plethora of studies from diverse sources indicates a consensus that climate changes will result from man's combustion of fossil fuels and changes in land use." And so we also begin to see here now the recognition, it's not just combustion, but also land use changes associated with agriculture and other issues. So we see that in 1979, there's a consensus that warming would happen. And also that it was not trivial, not a small concern. The scientists wrote, "The close linkage between man's welfare and the climatic regime within which his society has evolved suggests that such climatic changes would have profound impacts on human society." But there was a big question about which there was not yet a consensus, and that was the question of when. Was it 49 years? Most scientists in the 1970s did not think that changes would be detectable until the 21st century. So the year 2000 was often bandied about. So the scientific community was surprised when only 6 years later, NASA climate modeler Jim Hansen and his team concluded that the human fingerprint, the human signal, had in fact been detected. And he testified to that effect in the summer of 1988 in the US Congress, saying that he was 99% certain that man-made climate change was now detectable. And it was this emerging and disturbing finding that had contributed to the creation of the IPCC in that same year, in 1988. But it also led to something else, to the emergence of a politically motivated campaign to challenge that consensus and cast doubt upon that science. This campaign focused on the claim that the science was unsettled, that we didn't have a consensus, and therefore it was premature to act. So in our work, Eric Conway and I wanted to know, where did that claim come from? And the shocking discovery we made was that we could trace it back to a very small group of people with links to the American tobacco industry. Now today, as you know, doubt about climate change is promoted in many quarters, all the way to the White House, but it's particularly fostered in the United States by think tanks, institutes that promote free markets and market-based solutions to social problems. And one of the most important for a long time now, going back to the late 1980s, is the George C. Marshall Institute, a think tank in Washington, D.C. Since the late 1980s, they have either denied the reality of climate change or insisted that if there is warming, it's not caused by humans, or even if it is, that it doesn't really matter, that it's not significant, and we could just adapt. So where did the Marshall Institute come from? Who are these people, and why do they promote doubt about climate science? Because I've always said it's one thing to argue about what kind of solutions you want, market-based or command and control. It's a different thing to claim that the science is wrong or unsettled. So shockingly, the Marshall Institute was founded by scientists, by three very famous, very prominent, very brilliant Cold War physicists. On the left, Robert Jastrow, a prominent American astrophysicist who was active in the American space program. On the far right, William Nirenberg, a physicist who had worked on the Manhattan Project and then later became the longtime director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, where ironically he was the boss of Dave Keeling. And in the middle, Frederick Seitz, also a physicist, a solid-state physicist who had worked on the hydrogen bomb and later became president of the US National Academy of Sciences. So by no stretch of the imagination could we imagine that these men don't understand the science, right? These are scientists at the highest possible levels of American science and policy. But they all had one thing in common. They were all Cold Warriors who believed very, very strongly in a strong military defense against the Soviet Union. And in the early 1980s, they began to work together on an advisory panel to the Reagan administration on the Strategic Defense Initiative, sometimes called Star Wars. They were all strong proponents of Star Wars in opposition to many of their scientific colleagues, and they created the Marshall Institute explicitly to support Star Wars, to support the Reagan administration, and to continue to promote the view that the Soviet Union was a live threat that had to be actively resisted through science and technology. Now, a major part of this was to challenge Carl Sagan and Hans Bethe and other scientists who were leading the American scientific opposition to SDI. And later they would also fight with Sagan over nuclear winter. And I don't have time to go into the details, but here's just one example. So in 1987, Jastrow published an article in the National Review, which is a very conservative magazine in the United States, insisting that if the US did not act to expand its nuclear capabilities, the Soviet Union would overtake us and dictate terms. And you can see the headline, America has 5 years left. And this is in 1987, so the irony, I hope, is not lost on you. So clearly they were wrong in their predictions about Soviet strength. Now, at the time, Fred Seitz was also working at another job as consultant to the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Corporation. Now, it's now very well known through historical research and through lawsuits that the principal strategy that the tobacco industry used to defend its product against lawsuits and government regulation was what we've now called doubt-mongering, to insist that the science was unsettled, that we didn't really know if smoking caused cancer, and therefore it would be premature for governments to act to control tobacco use. What we found in our research was that in 1989, these two stories came together. The Cold War came to an end. The Soviet Union began to break apart. The Berlin Wall fell down. So you might think that these Cold Warriors would be happy that they had won, the US had won the Cold War, and what they had worked for had prevailed. But that's not what happened. Instead, they found a new enemy, and that new enemy was what they called environmental extremism. What they alleged was the exaggeration of environmental threats by people with a left-wing or even socialist agenda. And using the experience that Fred Seitz had with the tobacco industry, they applied those strategies and tactics to climate change, to say that the science was unsettled, that we didn't really know, and therefore we should not act to do anything about this issue. One of the most infamous memos that came out of tobacco litigation was the one that's sometimes referred to as the doubt is our product memo. So it goes like this: doubt is our product since it is the best means of competing with the body of fact that exists in the minds of the general public. And we now know that the tobacco industry spent literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars hiring advertising firms, public relations firms, and scientists to promote doubt about the science related to tobacco. And those same scientists then did the same thing, not just about tobacco, but about a whole set of issues during the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s, including nuclear winter, acid rain, stratospheric ozone depletion, and of course, global warming. The scientists in our stories cast doubt on the science on all these issues, and in every single case, the strategy was the same. We don't really know, there isn't a consensus, the science is unsettled, and therefore we should not regulate tobacco, regulate pesticides, fill in the blank, you can finish the sentence. Now, to understand exactly how they did this, you'll have to read our book, or you can now see the movie, because we have a film now. But what I want to spend the remainder of my time on is to explain why. Because for us, this was in some ways a mystery story. Why would prominent scientists turn against their own enterprise, turn against their own colleagues, turn against men who they had hired in their own institutions? Because this story is filled with ironies. Not only was Bill Nierenberg the boss of Dave Keeling, but Bob Jastrow hired Jim Hansen at NASA. So why would these men turn against their own colleagues? And why did these arguments gain traction? Which is perhaps the more important question. If it were just a bunch of old cranks, we wouldn't be here today. But this argument has gained so much traction that in the United States today, you can scarcely find a Republican in Congress who doesn't deny climate change, and you can scarcely find a Democrat who does. I mean, the issue is so polarized in the United States today that it's now difficult to talk about it, without it being viewed as a partisan political issue. So the short answer is ideology. It's the ideology of neoliberalism, what George Soros calls free market fundamentalism, and what I think of fundamentally in the United States as simply a long-standing American tradition of suspicion of and hostility to what would be sometimes referred to as, quote, big government. Now, this is a complicated issue, and I've been instructed to try to end by 10 o'clock, so I'll do my best to say this clearly without too much detail. But it's basically the idea that problems are best solutioned by allowing the marketplace to do its magic. So in recent years, neoliberalism has focused very much on deregulation, liberalization of trade, and reduction of regulations and trade barriers. These ideas came to prominence in the 1980s, so the same crucial moment when the science of climate change was coalescing, also the ideology of modern neoliberalism was too. It was particularly promoted in the United Kingdom by Margaret Thatcher and in the United States by Ronald Reagan, but it wasn't just conservatives, Tories, and Republicans. Throughout the 1990s, it was also promoted under what was referred to as the Washington Consensus, led by US Democratic President Bill Clinton and UK Labour leader Tony Blair. So we see a kind of broad political consensus on the virtues of deregulation and trade liberalization. And I think it's fair to say that until pretty recently, this is the ideology that has dominated in the G20 circles, at the World Economic Forum, and even on the pages of the New York Times. But in order to understand it, it's useful to go back and see where its intellectual roots lie, because they lie in the Cold War, and particularly with the work of two key thinkers, Friedrich von Hayek and the American Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman's book, Capitalism and Freedom, is a kind of Bible for many conservatives in the United States. It was published in 1962, right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, so in one of the coldest moments of the Cold War. And the argument is essentially this, that political freedom and economic freedom go hand in hand. And the simple reason is because if we allow governments to control the economy through centralization or excessive regulation, the only way to control an economy is to control the people in that economy. And therefore, it's only a matter of time before we see ourselves losing our democratic freedoms and we're on a kind of slippery slope to socialism. In the preface to Capitalism and Freedom, Friedman explicitly acknowledges his debt to Friedrich von Hayek, the Austrian neoliberal economist, whose key book, Road to Serfdom, essentially made this argument, that if the Western European nations allowed themselves to become socialistic through things like social democracy or nationalized health, we would be on, quote, the road to serfdom. And it would be only a matter of time before we found ourselves living under totalitarianism. Now, one of the many ironies of this story is that, of course, von Hayek's predictions did not come true. The United Kingdom didn't end up totalitarian. Western Europe did not end up communist. And yet, these ideas have taken tremendous hold in the United States. So I'm going to skip some of the details here in the interest of time, but simply to make the point that in the Cold War, this argument became crucial for American conservatives, who began to believe that it was equally important to fight encroachments on freedom at home as it was to fight the Soviet threat abroad. And so von Hayek's work, Friedman's work, became centerpieces for American conservatives. Now, to bring the story back to Robert Jastrow and his colleagues, they argued that the Cold War battle to protect freedom was not just being played out in the realm of nuclear weapons and strategic defense, but also in the role of government intervention in and regulation of the marketplace. And so they became adamant opponents of anything that they saw as leading to more government intervention. And this helps to explain the origins of the story in strategic defense and the Cold War. Jastrow and his colleagues understood their work as a kind of technological arm of the political commitment to the defense of American freedom. And this is why you'll see in a lot of climate change denial literature, you'll see the word freedom being invoked all the time. Freedom this, freedom that. In our film, we have a whole section where we see it show a rally of climate change deniers yelling, freedom, freedom. You can skip this. So if we return to the question of why these scientists would defend tobacco and cast doubt on the scientific evidence of its harms, the answer is because they see regulation as the slippery slope to socialism. And if you think about it, environmental and public health advocates typically were arguing at that time for government regulation. So they argued that from regulation of acid rain or secondhand smoke, it was only a small step towards government control more broadly. And this argument, I'll just give you one more example that shows how this argument operated in a specific case. So in this story, there's a fourth physicist who becomes involved shortly after the Marshall Institute is created. It's a man who's still alive, some of you may have encountered. His name is Fred Singer, and he, like the others, was a physicist. In fact, he was the proverbial rocket scientist. He was the first director of the US National Weather Satellite Service. So again, a very prominent scientist. And like the others, he was involved in campaigns to challenge the evidence of acid rain, global warming, and the ozone hole. And he also worked with the tobacco industry. In the early 1990s, Singer worked with the Philip Morris Tobacco Company to attack the US Environmental Protection Agency over the question of the effects of secondhand smoke. In 1993, he joined forces with a lawyer who worked for the Cato Institute and also the Competitive Enterprise Institute. So again, these think tanks promoting free market solutions. And they wrote a report that was widely circulated to the press called EPA and the Science of Environmental Tobacco Smoke. Now again, in our research, we were able to show this report was wholly funded by the tobacco industry, but they tried to hide their fingerprints, as they put it in their own words, by channeling the money through supposedly independent think tanks, in this case one called the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute. So again, you hear this is a name that invokes ideas of democracy and freedom, the idea that the Alexis de Tocqueville Institute is protecting democracy in America. But what does this report actually do? Well, the EPA had declared secondhand smoke to be a Class A or proven carcinogen. And this report had been affirmed in two separate independent reports by the US Surgeon General. It was also reviewed by an EPA independent peer review panel that reviewed over 6,000 peer-reviewed studies from the United States, Germany, Japan, Australia, and all around the world. So why would a rocket scientist, a physicist, challenge 6,000 peer-reviewed papers in epidemiology, oncology, and public health? Indeed, why would any scientist defend a product that we now knew killed children? Well, Fred Singer answered that question in his own words. He wrote, "If we do not carefully delineate the government's role in regulating dangers, there's essentially no limit to how much government can control our lives." So there it is, the road to serfdom argument. Cigarettes today, tomorrow the Bill of Rights. And Luntz made a similar point when he challenged climate change in the Wall Street Journal in 2003, shortly before his conversion. Actually, he's converted and converted back twice now. He wrote, "Once we concede that greenhouse gases must be controlled, it will only be a matter of time before we end up endorsing more damaging regulation." So what we see in all of these documents, all of these letters, all of these reports, this debate was not about the science. We almost never see in this any actual discussion of the equilibrium climate sensitivity or the parameterization of climate models or measurement techniques for measuring gas bubbles. None of these technical issues come up. I mean, almost never. What we see is a constant theme of government, government control, regulation, freedom, liberty, markets, individual choice, and whether or not the government should intervene in the marketplace to protect us, citizens, from dangerous products and activities. And their answer in every single case, no matter what the challenge is, their answer is always no. In their writings, in fact, contrarians frequently insert that environmentalists, and also by implication scientists working on environmental issues, people like yourselves, are socialists whose hidden agenda is to control people's lives. They refer to environmentalists as watermelons, green on the outside but red on the inside. George Will, who writes for the Washington Post, has called environmentalism a green tree with red roots. Senator James Inhofe, who has threatened to indict climate scientists for conspiracy to lie to Congress, has accused me personally of being part of a liberal conspiracy to bring down global capitalism, to which I say liberals should be so organized. And during the previous presidential election, back in 2011, when Republican candidate Mitt Romney broke with his party and was the only candidate to say that he thought humans were contributing to global warming, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich immediately attacked him, saying that the push to address climate change is just, quote, the newest excuse to take control of our lives. So you see the sort of specter of totalitarianism hovering over the country and thing. Now, I only have a couple of minutes left, and there are many things I could say about this, but since this is a group of environmental scientists and ecologists, I want to emphasize that of the many lies and untruths that these people have perpetuated, to me the most outrageous one is the idea that environmentalism is a green tree with red roots, because it's not. In the United States, the origins of the environmental movement are not found in the labor movements or the international workers of the world, much less the Trotskyites or the communists, which we did actually once have in America, but in the republicanism of Teddy Roosevelt, Gifford Pinchot, and of course that famous communist John D. Rockefeller. This was a Republican movement. And indeed, throughout most of the 20th century until the 1970s, there was a bipartisan consensus in the United States on the importance of environmental protection. In fact, some of the strongest environmentalists in America were Republicans, not Democrats. The Wilderness Act, the Clean Air Act, the entire structure of modern environmental regulation in the United States passed Congress by large bipartisan margins. But that began to change in the 1980s when we, scientists, began to discover evidence we hadn't looked for, really, of serious problems like acid rain and the ozone hole, problems that seemed to demand that the government do something, have some kind of regulation. And these issues emerged scientifically in what I would argue is kind of just a piece of really bad luck. They emerged and coalesced scientifically at the very moment that the Reagan administration was arguing for less government and less regulation, precisely as advocated by Milton Friedman, shown here shaking hands with the president. And this, I would argue, put the Reagan administration and later the entire Republican Party and arguably even the entire neoliberal consensus on a collision course with modern science. Now, in the 1950s, the anthropologist Ashley Montagu asserted that reality has a well-known liberal bias. I would say that maybe it's not a liberal bias, but reality has pointed out the reality of market failure, and therefore the need for some kinds of government action, whether it's an emissions trading system or a carbon tax or the Paris Accord. Now, Ronald Reagan had a point. Government regulation is not the solution to every problem, and some environmentalists are socialists. And moreover, as we all know, the cutting edge of science is always unsettled. There's always uncertainty in science, and there's always room for healthy doubt, evidence-based doubt. That's where science takes place. That's where discovery takes place. So we never want to be in a position of saying that we know absolutely everything. Of course we don't. But the fact that we don't know everything doesn't mean that we don't know anything. And it doesn't mean that DDT and acid rain and the ozone hole and secondhand smoke weren't all real problems supported by real scientific evidence and needing real solutions to protect people. In other words, it doesn't mean the science was wrong. And we know that none of these issues was a hoax. But it does mean that market capitalism, like any system, has its limits. And environmental damage is an example of these limits, what the economists call negative externalities. Just two more slides. The common thread in all these otherwise diverse issues is that they were all market failures. They were all examples of behaviors that generated large external costs and therefore provided justification for some sort of government intervention in the marketplace. Indeed, Nicholas Stern, the former chief economist of the World Bank, has called anthropogenic global warming the greatest and widest ranging market failure ever seen. So not surprisingly then, environmentalist liberals and Europeans were pretty quick to accept these realities because these people didn't really have a problem with a government intervention. But conservatives, libertarians, and Americans have been slow to accept them, have fallen into denial. How we feel about regulation affects how we feel about the reality of climate change. And as we all know, we're all much more likely to accept evidence consistent with our pre-existing worldviews. But as the great conservative American jurist Richard Posner has pointed out, a rational decision maker starts with a prior probability, but adjusts that probability as new evidence comes to attention. For more than 25 years now, evidence has been mounting that man-made climate change is real, evidence that our scientists now tell us is unequivocal, and is already having significant impacts all around the globe. The Industrial Revolution brought the developed world 150 years of unprecedented prosperity. There's no question that in many ways burning fossil fuels has been, until now, a good thing. But it's not good anymore. There's a bill for all this prosperity, and that bill is global warming. And it's a bill that has now come due. And as the great American novelist Kim Stanley Robinson has pointed out, the invisible hand never picks up the check. Thank you very much.
Just one question. Yeah. Okay, yeah. So we have very little time. So I will ask one question on behalf of the audience. And what can be done? What can we do?
Yeah.
What can we do? Seems like the fight is all over again.
Yeah.
And the bad guys are in power.
Yeah.
So what can we do?
Thank you. Well, I think you're right. First of all, the bad guys are in power, and I think we have to accept that. It's a painful idea, but I think you can't fix a problem if you don't have the correct diagnosis. And so a lot of this work for me has really been about understanding where this is coming from. So it means two things. First of all, the science remains extremely important, because it is the science that provides us the basis for understanding not just that this thing is happening, but why it's so important to people's lives. So I think it's terribly important for all of us to be active explaining to the media, to our students, to our friends, our colleagues, our neighbors, why climate change matters. And I do think that in the scientific community, particularly in the United States, where I spend most of my time, but not only there, I think even in the circles of the IPCC, there's been tremendous amounts of effort on the science, but not so much in explaining to people why it matters. And I think many of us have had this experience. We talked about it last night. People say, well, why should I care about Larsen B? Or why should I care about, Antarctica? I live in Israel, or I live in New York. So it's up to us to explain why those things matter to people and how climate change is already now affecting us through heat waves, impacts on coral reefs, water supply, national security. I think that's kind of the central question for us as scientists. And then the other thing I think is also to point out that climate change denial is not about the science, that this is a political problem rooted in neoliberal opposition to government intervention. There's also in America, a whole kind of anti-international thing that Donald Trump has really brought into focus. So also to point out, there are many possible solutions, and many of them are market-based. And if you don't want big government, there are ways to do this with what I call medium government. I don't think this can be solved just by individuals changing their light bulbs, but I also think that some of the anxieties that some of my fellow Americans feel can be addressed. In the States right now, there's a big movement now to talk about carbon pricing systems on the state level, and that makes a lot of conservatives much less nervous, because there tend to be less anxiety about state government than the federal government for a variety of historic reasons. So I think there are things we can do to acknowledge the politics and allay people's anxieties and make it clear to people this is not a conspiracy to bring back Soviet-style totalitarianism.